Dispatch founder and editor Steve Hayes on the 2024 gun debate and how the Georgia school shooting might change it. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also a CNN contributor and founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free newsletter today if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America. You can also, of course, buy a membership if you want to support our reporting and get access to exclusive pieces of journalism you will not find anywhere else. This week, we are talking about the election and the state of gun politics in the election. And to do that, we have one of my favorite writers and a man who runs an outlet that I write for and enjoy a lot. Steve Hayes of the Dispatch is with us this week. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Hey, Stephen. Good to be with you.
Thank you so much for joining us. Obviously, I've been on your show a couple of times, written for the Dispatch. We've had some Dispatch writing in the Reload. So, there's a bit of symbiosis there. And I think we have a similar mission and worldview in terms of focusing on hard news reporting first and bring as honest analysis as we possibly can.
Well, let me just say to that point, I mean, congratulations on everything you've built. I mean, it's been pretty incredible. We had a nice long lunch. I don't know what that was now, 4 years ago, something like that, where we talked about all this. And this was just sort of a dream of yours. And to see what you've made of it, and to see how you've managed to keep in a media environment where, clicks and outrage are always the temptation, to see that you've prioritized real reporting and fact-based analysis. Really a credit to you and to your style of journalism, and just give you my congrats.
No, I really appreciate that. And look, you know this because we talked before I launched, but the Dispatch is one of the outlets that I think blazed the trail in this independent media landscape and inspired me to go and do this. So the Reload wouldn't exist if you guys hadn't been successful in taking a similar approach to what you're doing. So I really appreciate that as well. And it's been great to, collaborate occasionally.
Yeah, for sure.
But so let's get into the state of the race, right? 2024 election, Donald Trump, Kamala Harris. Gun politics has actually become somewhat while this race has been kind of wild and all over the place. The gun politics, I think, have become fairly stabilized at this point since Kamala Harris took over. Her campaign walked back her previous support for a mandatory buyback of AR-15s and similar firearms, so-called assault weapons. But she's generally stuck with essentially what the Biden campaign was doing: universal background checks, red flag laws, and an assault weapons ban on sales. And she's kind of kept that as a significant part of her campaign. It was in the platform, had a whole section on it. And they had a night where they talked about gun control at the convention. Not the top priority by any means, I don't think. I don't know that it's any different than the last couple of Democratic presidential election cycles, but certainly a significant part of what she's running on. And then on the other side, you've had Donald Trump, who has been more quiet on the issue. I don't think he's changed policies necessarily, but the RNC, the platform, didn't have. They took out a lot of the gun rights promises on the policy side. Didn't have a gun rights speaker or night like the Democrats did. Trump didn't mention it in his speech. They've stayed relatively quiet. And that's kind of been the state of play. I'm interested in why you think things have gone in that particular direction.
Yeah, I think you've characterized it exactly right. I mean, I would say that Kamala Harris has basically what we might regard as sort of standard issue Democratic gun policy, right? And in that sense, she is just mostly promising to continue what the Biden administration has done. And, when they talk about it, they look to contrast their positions with those of the Trump administration, with Donald Trump in particular, with the NRA, of course. and otherwise haven't made it a big issue. I read your piece from over the weekend about the possibility that a mass shooting could change the dynamic if we had one. And, I think the polling that you captured in that analysis is right. It's just hasn't been for the better part of this year, in part, I think, due to the absence of mass shootings. It's not an issue that when you ask Americans sort of what's top of mind as you think about voting, this isn't one of them. I think that could change in the event of a significant mass shooting. I mean, this is when you see the kinds of policy changes. We have these debates sort of in fits and starts, and it's often reactive and responsive. I think, in the event that we did have something like that, you could see changes. And I think certainly you'd see the number of people responding to pollsters asking that question, what matters to you most, would be higher in the event of a mass shooting that took many lives, for instance.
Right.
And on the Trump side, yeah, go ahead.
Well, obviously there was the school shooting that happened this week. And I do want to get talking about that as potential to be that thing that changes this dynamic for a number of reasons. But yeah, I was just zeroing in on that, how gun politics tend to go, like, how things have usually gone over the years when looking at especially gun polling, right? It tends to be sort of a middle of the pack issue, right? Is that how you would quantify or how you've seen it in the past?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think the people who are passionate about the issue, I mean, in some ways, and I know you've made this comparison before in asking questions, I mean, in some ways it is the politics of guns like the politics of abortion. The people who care about it deeply, can be single issue voters on the matter. And, I think we're seeing in this moment in a political world after the Dobbs decision, abortion become more relevant to people because of what has happened and because of the changes to the law and the changes that elected officials are talking about. You see similar things in gun policy, and the extent to which it's a driver of voting behavior reflective on events and potentially bigger changes in laws.
Okay. So this sort of, I guess, stagnation to some degree that we've gotten in the race on, look, our gun politics have generally been stagnated for about 30 years, right?
Yeah.
So we're arguing over a lot of the same
on a macro level, yeah,
policies that we've been arguing about since the 90s, right? Assault weapons bans, universal background checks. Red flag laws is a little newer, but
right.
Even that seems to have mostly stabilized with people on either side of the issue. But, in particular, I don't know, what do you think, especially about the one thing that I've seen in this race since the conventions, at least, that's a bit interesting, a bit odd, is the lack of emphasis on Donald Trump's part. He hasn't been totally silent on it, but he hasn't talked much about it. And like, I just mentioned what happened at the convention itself. It hasn't even been the same level of priority that Harris has had, which, and I don't think Harris is making it her big policy issue. I think she's doing a pretty like you said, it's where where she is where Democrats are now. It's left of where they were 15 years ago, but it's where most of the party is at. But Trump, what do you make of the silence? That one's a little bit puzzling to me. I'm interested in your view.
Well, I think we have to look at everything through the prism of the assassination attempt, right? Which took place just days before the Republican Party started. Right. And, if you have an assassination attempt of a high profile elected official, you might expect to see calls for the restrictions on gun ownership, on background, I think we would see sort of a revitalization of the arguments that Democrats have been making for a long time in light of something like that, just as often happens in the aftermath of mass shootings. But I think in this case, because it was Donald Trump, he certainly wasn't going to be the one to say, hey, I think we ought to, implement additional restrictions. We ought to revisit some of the policy debates that we've had, because I think that's not where his base of voters is. And for Kamala Harris, I think in that context, that wasn't the argument that she wanted to make. I mean, or maybe it's better to say that that wasn't the context for the arguments that she probably does want to make, given that it was an assassination attempt on President Trump. So I think you had this sort of strange moment where both sides said, you know what, we're not going to do politics on this thing. And you know, to a certain extent, I would like to believe, I sort of the optimist in me, the Pollyanna in me, would like to believe that's because of the gravity of the situation itself, maybe compelled some level of restraint, but it's hard to think that way. I mean, I think they all sort of checked their political interests and said, there's not really much to be gained by engaging in this debate in this context, so we're going to leave it alone. And I think that's what they did.
There was an attempt, or at least there were the general press releases and comments that you'd see from gun control groups in this regard, but it wasn't a major push, certainly. Right. And you know, it's interesting though. So you think that it was more Trump being understanding that his voters would not like him to change policies on guns that kept him from doing that in the aftermath of, I mean, he did get shot, like it was there, but he got shot by somebody with an AR-15. He has previously in his private life before politics supported assault weapons ban. Right. There's New York Times reporting that said he considered supporting one after El Paso, but didn't do it because he was advised it would be, you know, politically disadvantageous for him. Like his supporters wouldn't like it. And so you think that would make sense for why he hasn't changed. Yeah. I mean,
I think he's attuned to what his supporters want. I mean, we're seeing this weird on a macro level, sort of moving beyond gun policy debates. We're seeing this weird convergence of the party's policies prescriptions. You have had, whether it's Kamala Harris remaking herself into a border hawk or Donald Trump touting his willingness to protect the quote unquote reproductive rights of women using the language of the pro-choice movement. But we've seen this sort of on issue after issue after issue. And a lot of that, I think, comes on the Republican side of this because Donald Trump doesn't have very strong convictions on policy. You know, we know the issues he really cares about, right? He really cares about immigration. I think it's fair to say he really cares he's passionate about trade issues. But I don't think he's passionate about abortion, to use the one that we spoke about just a moment ago. And I don't think he's passionate about Second Amendment issues. I think his sons are, in a way that their dad is not. But I don't think this is an issue that really moves Trump. And I think we saw that throughout the Trump administration. I think if you look back at the Trump administration from the perspective of Second Amendment advocates, you would say, the guy more or less ended up where we thought he probably would and where most people would like, most pro-Second Amendment activists and voters would like. But there were moments where we saw him sort of sometimes muse aloud about going in another direction or being open to restrictions that, most Republicans would have rejected in the past. And I think that's because this is just not an issue where he pays a lot of attention and where he has sort of deep convictions on the issue. So that would be another reason to explain, in part, in addition to the fact that we haven't been having these debates because we haven't seen as many mass shootings over the course of 2024 and this election year. But also Trump's just lack of conviction on the issue, I think, doesn't compel him to speak about it if he doesn't need to.
That's interesting. But, because that's, if he's not changing his policy positions because of concern about backlash from his supporters, why is he keeping quiet on it? Because that feels to me like a play similar to the abortion play, politically, where he's trying to appeal to a certain kind of voter, suburban women, right, might be the target, a broad demographic of people who are uncomfortable with Donald Trump and are probably distinct from the Republican Party on the issue of abortion and gun rights. So that feels like that would be the play, but I don't know. But he's also not actually changing his positions. It doesn't appear so far. It's just
yeah. I mean, on abortion,
that's what puzzles me.
I don't know. He may end up in the same place, but I think over the last week, he's had about 4 different positions on abortion.
Oh, right. Yeah, on abortion. That's what I mean. Like, that's the counter. Like, look what he's doing there. He's actually moving around his position, maybe a bit haphazardly, but he seems to be trying to triangulate some sort of.
So I think
almost like a Simpsons scene of tiny American flags for everyone, abortions for some, tiny American flags for everybody else.
I don't.
But
think,
he's not doing that with guns.
I don't ascribe to him a lot of strategic thinking on this. Honestly, I think for the most part, what he's doing is articulating his point of view in the moment. Based on an interview question that he gets, or based on where his mind takes him during a rally speech. He will sort of create policy. I mean, of course, he was famous for doing this while president. Talk to people who worked for him, or particularly worked on the communication side of him. He would have a set policy prescription. Sometimes they would be doing a policy rollout at the White House with members of Congress engaged and the White House comms team having done, days or weeks worth of prep work on a certain policy. And then Trump will say something entirely different and everything is blown up. Everything is upset. And then it's a scramble to try to sort of reinterpret what he means. That's my sense of what he's been doing on abortion here. I mean, I think he's sort of generally aware that in these statewide referenda and in some of the polling, I think he now sees this as more of a liability than a strength, and thinks, in effect, I've done a lot of the heavy lifting that the pro-life community asked me to do during my 4 years as president, and I don't owe him anymore. So I'm going to say whatever the heck I want. And then he says it. It wouldn't surprise me if we saw him do something similar on guns. I just don't think he's being asked to do it or pressed to do it right now.
Yeah. I mean, because I wrote a piece for the Dispatch in May, I guess it was, that, with the idea that he could absolutely go the same route with gun rights supporters that he's going with pro-lifers.
Where do you think I'm stealing all my material from?
But, that's the odd thing about it to me is that he's just not doing that. And the thing, that piece is from May, right? And it was pretty obvious what he was doing with pro-lifers back in May. Like, he telegraphs this stuff pretty long out when he makes these kinds of changes. He still really hasn't settled on a hard position on abortion at this point. He went back and forth over the Florida referendum. And there is a big difference between how the pro-life issue has performed in ballot initiatives in red states, even losing in Kansas, places like that, and pro-gun initiative or gun ballot initiatives. Gun control initiative barely passed in Oregon this year, a deep blue state. Kansas had a pro-gun one that passed with huge numbers. So it's not the same obvious decay in support looking at it from a political standpoint, it's easier to see why he's more nervous about the pro-life issue than the gun issue, but it's just kind of an odd position. And I do think you see what you described there with this idea that whoever talked to Trump last might be able to plant a seed of an idea in his head that they'd like. And I think one of the things that Trump has been consistent on with gun voters lately, or gun owners, is that he's said this idea that they don't vote. That seems to come up a number of times over the last couple of months from Trump. And it's something that seems to have come from his co-campaign chair, Chris LaCivita, who was quoted saying exactly that same thing in a Notice article about an event at during the RNC. And I don't know. I mean, is that just, I don't understand the political calculation. If you think they don't vote, why
wouldn't you talk about it to make them vote?
Right.
Yeah. Wouldn't you make an argument? Yeah.
Or just give them up and go with a more moderate position on I just am a little bit flummoxed about why they're doing this sort of quiet campaign instead.
Yeah. I mean, I think it could be, and again, there are I mean, these parallels are not exact in any of the situations that we're describing about, but I mean, the way you laid out the comparisons between abortion politics and gun politics in that piece for us, and as you've done for the Reload, I think none of the comparisons are exact, but they're certainly overlapping and I think persuasive. I think if you look at where Trump is right now, I mean, you're seeing this. He's going back and forth. I think he's trying to figure this out on the question of abortion. He has largely, I think, taken for granted that pro-life voters will support him, because I think the assumption is, look at Kamala Harris.
Right.
She's, you could describe her as an abortion enthusiast, right? She is a very strong pro-choice politician. Her running mate has talked about needing to be sort of reined in by Nancy Pelosi because he was so excited about abortion. And I think if you're the Trump campaign, you look at that and say, like, where are pro-lifers going to go? What are they going to do? And they're not going to stay home because he made good on his court appointments on the Supreme Court overturning Roe, which is something that he said and he brags about, and then he sort of walks away from a little bit, tries to create some distance. I think the same thing is happening with gun owners. I mean, are gun owners going to move en masse to the candidate who's promising universal background checks and,
who called for confiscation of AR-15s.
Right? Of AR-15s, right.
She may have her campaign may have walked that back, but everybody knows what her history is on
what she
issue.
Said in the past pretty consistently, which is different than what she said now as she's trying to be elected. So I think, from their perspective, they're saying, we don't need to campaign on this. I think the question, you're in a better position to answer this certainly than I am, is, does this relative silence on the issue, could that leave low propensity gun owners to say, I'm staying home, I'm not going? I think that's the risk if you're the Trump campaign, not that you're going to see some movement to Kamala because he's not talking enough, but like, do you get people who say, like, man, he's not even talking about the issues I care a lot about, and it's therefore not worth my time to go vote?
Yeah, and look, maybe their campaign may be a little more sophisticated about than what we've gotten into here. Like, he's not talking about it in high profile moments in his. I mean, it's kind of wild that he went a whole hour and a half in his acceptance speech and didn't mention it, gun policy a single time at all. But I think in moments where he's speaking to gun owners specifically, like NRA events. He's going to continue to make the same promises, is what it seems like. And so maybe they're just trying to de-emphasize it in moments that people who aren't watching specifically for gun policy are, paying attention to, the high profile stuff. And then just more focused on gun owners they're going to be. But this is it's just a bit odd, because it's like, if you really think gun owners don't vote, and that's an issue for your campaign because gun owners are largely inclined to support Trump over Kamala Harris, given the policy differences. You would think going out and trying to win their votes would be the solution.
And it's an odd thing to say also, because when you look back at the history of grassroots movements of gun owners and what they've done to get people to the polls, I mean, it's just sort of counter historical, honestly. Now, maybe that's a reflection of their current polling or what they're seeing in terms of base motivation. But I think it is an odd thing to say.
It is. It's an odd thing to be one of the more prominent talking points on guns for your policy, for your campaign. Right. I don't know. But you said earlier that one of the reasons you think maybe he's not changing positions or not talking about this as much is because there just hasn't been a lot of emphasis on the issue. There hasn't been a lot of pressure for him to change positions or try to moderate. Obviously the race has changed significantly since Harris took over the top of the ticket. Right. He's trailing in most of the polling now, not massively. It's obviously a very close race, and I think most of your political talking head types would call it a toss-up at this point. But that's pretty different from where it was just a month ago.
Right.
And So there's some pressure there for him to maybe try to broaden his appeal. And then, we just had this school shooting, a terrible, horrific shooting, brings gun violence, the negative aspects of this issue for Republicans up to the forefront potentially. And so I guess, do we think this is going to change the dynamics of the gun debate in the 2024 election? Like, we saw the two candidates react, and I would say, honestly, their reactions didn't indicate any sort of significant change on their part. Harris called for the same three policies again in her speech, didn't backtrack and start calling for mandatory buyback of ARs or anything like that. Trump's reaction was, to call the attacker sick, and he promised to, quote, heal the world. Didn't say anything about gun policy. He had a town hall with Fox News. So I don't know. Things still seem the same at this moment. It has only been a day or so while we're talking here, but could this shake things up? Could this bring that sort of attention and pressure to push either of these candidates in a different direction?
I mean, I suppose it could, but I suspect that if it were going to bring sort of more fundamental changes, we would have heard some indication of that in those early reactions on both sides. I think that the question, we've got 60-ish days left. And again, this is something you engaged in that terrific analysis from over the weekend, is sort of if you have a mass shooting in which, a dozen or more people are killed, lots of injuries, something like Las Vegas, for instance, what kind of effect would that have on the race? And I think something like that would likely have a pretty profound effect on the race, because I think what you'd see is Kamala Harris move from her base, sort of the standard issue Democratic position on guns broadly, and revive some of these other policies that Democrats talk about and sometimes push sporadically, and particularly in response to these mass casualty attacks. And then the real question would be, what does Trump do? Because if it's the case that Trump and his campaign leaders really believe that gun owners don't vote, why wouldn't they? I mean, and if they have polling to support that supposition, it's come up a couple times. So, you imagine that they're not just sort of making it up. Would that mean that Trump, as he has in the past, would try to move to the center in this as part of this sort of broader blurring of ideological distinctions that I think we have really been seeing over the course of this campaign, particularly in response to on the issue of guns? And I do think that's possible, precisely for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. I don't think this is a conviction issue for Donald Trump. I think he'll be wary of disappointing his supporters. I think some of the people who are his hardest core supporters are also very strong Second Amendment advocates, and I think he'd be nervous about pissing them off, frankly. But if Donald Trump is speaking instinctively or reacting or talking in an interview or giving a rally speech, it would at all surprise me to see him revisit some of the moments where he was sort of openly musing about more restrictive gun policy as president.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I keep expecting might happen at some point, but because a lot of these things line up with how he's moved on the abortion issue, but he's just not doing it. And that's, I don't know, it's kind of a fascinating thing to watch. And I guess you're right. I mean, one of the things that I've noticed with this Georgia shooting is how hard it is to even tell in our current media landscape. Like, things move so much faster than they ever have before, in my opinion. I don't know if you've noticed this or if you feel the same way.
Absolutely.
But I don't know if, is this the Trump assassination attempt was not that long ago.
Right.
And people barely talk about that anymore. I think a lot of people have almost, think it's old news at this point. It's like a month
It's sort
ago.
of amazing. It's sort of amazing given how close he came and given the tremendous sort of the widespread and deep security failures that made that even a possibility. It's extraordinary that we don't hear much of it. But I think part of the reason is, again, there's neither side, 2 months out from this election, sees an advantage to continuing to talk about it. I mean, Trump brings it up. He will talk about it.
Sure.
Remember at the convention, he said, I'm going to tell the story. He gave that sort of moment by moment. I think, a lot of people
That's probably
found
the
it
strongest part of his
pretty
speech.
gripping. Yeah. And then vowed not to talk about it because he couldn't talk about it anymore. Well, he's talked about it a lot.
Right.
I mean, he's told that story again and again and again, as I think many of us expected he would at the time. But he hasn't, as you suggest, he hasn't really built sort of a policy program on this. And I think for the same reasons that we talked about earlier, it's just they don't see a political advantage to doing that at this point.
Yeah, but I wonder if it wouldn't take something like something like Uvalde or Las Vegas to really be the thing that shakes up the race on gun politics. Because I don't know, things move so quickly now that whether this Georgia shooting is going to break through for a long period of time and actually change how the race proceeds is, I think, an open question. You seem skeptical that it was going to have that effect. I mean, it's super early. Maybe there'll be more details that come out that bring it to the forefront of news for a while. But I don't know.
It's an unbelievably horrifying event. Like, you read the stories about this and the reports that the FBI had been sort of tipped off to this shooter, and may indicate another failure to sort of follow up. But I guess in the early days, I think part of it certainly is the speed of information today. There are so many things that are being covered or even sort of less covered than at least talked about, that whatever it is, whether it's the assassination attempt, I mean, I'm trying to think of another policy event. Remember the Olympics opening ceremony was all anybody talked about for 24 hours, and nobody talks about it at all anymore. I mean, the news cycle moves so quickly because of the proliferation of media outlets and, what will capture people's attention. People have short attention spans. So I do think that's a factor. The other question, I think, as it relates to, a gun policy debate is, what do we learn about this shooting and this shooter that could, allow Democrats to push for changes in policy? And at least in these early hours, it's not clear that there is something like that.
Yeah, certainly not necessarily something in the big three policies that everybody fights over, the ones that Harris is pushing for already, other than he did use an AR-15.
Right.
Just like the Trump assassination attempt.
Right, but because he's underage, I mean, I think there's, there are all sorts of there are all sorts of questions that complicate a straight line argument, and so I imagine that's part of the reason that we're not seeing it being made.
Yeah, that's I think that's really good insight, because sometimes if it lined up more directly with the policies that we have stagnated on fighting about at a national level.
Right.
It probably could have a greater impact. But I think because, this is this 14-year-old, couldn't legally buy guns on their own, shouldn't have legally been able to have access to an unsupervised a rifle. And then obviously bringing it to school is legal. So many things, so many laws were already broken in the commission of this crime that it's harder to connect that to, not impossible. Obviously, it's still going to be something that probably drives attention and drives up interest in the issue, and will certainly, I imagine, be part of the Harris campaign on specifically an assault weapons ban. But yeah, like you said, I don't know if it were more directly connected to the politics of the issue, it might have more staying power, a more disruptive effect. But
Right.
But I guess
which doesn't make it any less horrifying. I mean,
No,
you read the stories, and the story about the teacher and or two teachers and two students. I mean, it's horrifying in some ways, incredibly frustrating. If it is in fact the case that the people were constantly telling to speak up about these things did in fact speak up, and there were some warnings
preventable,
and those went unheeded.
Preventable.
I mean, I think it's horrifying sort of in every way. On a human level, but even more frustrating if it's the case that that it might have been preventable or at least addressable.
Yeah, well, there were apparently threats called in that day. They had school resource officers on campus who likely saved lives by intervening as quickly as they did, but obviously were not able. The security procedures that they put in place after the threats those mornings clearly didn't work.
Right.
As well as they should have. And so, there's a lot more that could have been done that's beyond what the national political debate over guns is.
Right.
So, that may be one factor as to why it might not.
Well, and these are these are incredibly challenging, gut-wrenching moments, requiring nuanced debate, good faith from people who want to address the problem, solve the problems. And, it won't surprise you to hear me say that that's not what our politics specializes in right now. Right. I mean, now we are we engage largely in performative politics on all sides. And it's what can I get out of this moment to advance the next the next inch. And if there's something to be gained, I'm going to exploit it. And if there's nothing to be gained, I'm going to be silent about it.
And, I will say, too, that Trump's reaction, while it didn't discuss policy at all, probably the visceral way of calling, where he calls the perpetrator a monster and sick and wrong, like that's probably how a lot of people feel in the moment as well. So it's not, totally there. You can see why there's some appeal to that as in addition or, parallel to what Harris was doing. With her own speech. So, it's just, we'll have to see. I think obviously the big factor will be how voters feel. Like if they start to put guns higher up in their priority lists over this, then I think it could have that.
I mean, the polling on this better than I do for sure. But I mean, I think one of the polls that you cited in this piece over the weekend suggested that it was 3% of voters said it was, a top issue or the top issue.
The top issue.
That's a low number, and of course it represents people on both sides, right, or all sides of the issue. It could be people who are very strongly for additional restrictions are in that 3%, and people who say don't take my guns are
and that was
in that 3%. I think the question is, could if you had a mass shooting, where do those numbers get to? Just in terms of the political impact, where do those numbers get to, and how long do they stay? And that will determine.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing about the cycle of these attacks is people generally put this in a mid-level issue. In fact, that Fox poll showed it at. It's like the second to last issue that they polled. I think crime was the last one by 1%. So, economy issues tend to dominate in these issue polling, just generally across all times, whether the economy is good or bad. Obviously, even more so when people perceive the economy as not doing well. But and then guns and social issues, abortion, things like immigration tend to be lower down. Immigration's been higher up recently because it's been in the news a lot. There's been a lot of illegal immigration. People are concerned about it. But guns tend to become a higher priority issue for most people in the immediate aftermath of these shootings. Exactly. And that's when you tend to see greater support for new restrictions. And then as time goes on, they subside in both interest and support for new restrictions. So that's the thing about a mass shooting at this point between now and the election that could make it particularly impactful because, 2 months, that's when you're in that swing of people paying more attention to it in the aftermath of a high profile. It doesn't have to be a mass shooting. There's obviously debate over the definitions of mass shootings. This is actually the first one, I believe, that'll fit the Violence Project definition this year, which is pretty unusual.
Right.
Because you usually get somewhere between 5 and 10 per year. At least we have in recent history. And so this year's been a pretty low number. No, I don't know why. That's for another podcast, I suppose. But yeah, coming at this moment, before the election, that's when it could have the most political impact, because that's the cycle of this.
Right. Yep.
It's something that we can unfortunately track because of the way this stuff unfolds. But
it moves campaigns that seem now content not to make this a big issue.
Yeah.
It would potentially move them in the kind of reactive, responsive way that we've discussed to talk about it and to prioritize it.
It could. We'll have to see if that happens. It doesn't appear to have happened yet, right? That you agree on that?
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, look, we appreciate you coming on, giving us your time and giving us your insight. You've always been one of my favorite writers, well before the Dispatch, but I really like what you guys are trying to pull off over there. Seems to be going well so far. And so I'm really happy to have you on. Can you tell people just a little bit more about the Dispatch and where they can, find more of your writing and podcasts and stuff?
We started the Dispatch in October of 2019. So we're approaching our 5-year anniversary, which is sort of hard to imagine. This is why I have all this gray hair and a gray beard. I was totally black hair before that. That's not true. What we focus on is fact-based reporting and analysis from a center-right perspective. And this is one of the reasons why we have so much overlap with what you do. We're sort of unapologetic about the fact that we come from the center-right. Jonah Goldberg, who's my co-founder, and I would describe ourselves as movement conservatives going on 3 decades. So that's where we come from. But our main objective is to be intellectually honest with people. And so people know they might not agree with us. In fact, we hope that people occasionally don't agree with us because we challenge our own assumptions. We like to test other people's assumptions, including our readers and our members. And we think that at the end of that process, people will look at what we produce and say, yeah, you know what, I really trust this because I know that these guys, they might be wrong about what they're saying, or I might disagree with what they're saying, but we know that they come to it honestly and they've done the work. So that's what we've tried to do. We're having a fun time doing it. As I say, I've aged a lot in the past 5 years. There's been no shortage of things to cover. That's for sure. But we think we provide a pretty good guide to people who are interested in just getting kind of the straight dope on politics, policy, and culture.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. Well, you can head over to thedispatch.com if you guys want to check out their offerings today. I'm a paid member and have been since the beginning. So I believe in what you guys are doing, and I appreciate you taking the time. But that's all we've got for you guys this week. We will see you guys again real soon.